On the night my sister Claire married beneath the chandeliers of the Seaview estate, the air was rich with roses, champagne, and the kind of expectation that presses on your ribs. I believed I was there to celebrate, but in a quiet side room away from the music, my parents stood beside her new in-laws, speaking as if my Bell 429 helicopter had always been theirs to claim. It had taken me years of study debt and relentless work to earn it, yet they wanted it for their entrances and photographs. I said no. My father's hand struck before I could take a step back, the sound sharp enough to cut through the hum outside, while in the doorway whispers and camera flashes caught the moment forever. My name is Maddie Whitmore, 32, and that night I learned how easily family can turn possession into entitlement. The string of pearls around my neck felt heavier than it should have as I moved between tables, each step measured, each smile fixed in place. Glass clinked somewhere beyond the crowd, laughter swelled and broke like waves, and the scent of peonies and champagne wrapped around me in a way that felt more suffocating than sweet. My sister Claire was the bride, radiant in lace and diamonds, and I was the one they'd nearly forgotten to invite. I had just accepted a flute of champagne from a passing waiter when I caught my father's eyes across the room. Richard Whitmore didn't usually summon me with a look, but tonight he did. His chin tilted toward the side hall that led to the smaller reception room. I excused myself from a couple discussing sailboats and followed him. Inside, the air was cooler, quieter. My mother Margaret stood near the marble fireplace, arms folded tightly. Claire was there in her gown, Ethan beside her with his hand resting on her back. Next to them, Patricia and Gerald Wallace, Ethan's parents, wore matching expectant smiles. My father closed the door behind me, the soft click echoing in the silence. He gestured toward the empty armchair in the center of the room. "Sit down, Maddie. We need to talk about something important." I stayed standing. "What's going on?" Patricia's voice took over, smooth and practiced. "We were thinking, given your unique resources, it would make sense for you to let Claire and Ethan use your helicopter. Just for the first few years while they get established." It was such a casual delivery, as if she had asked to borrow a serving dish. My pulse quickened. "My helicopter is not for loan. It's registered under my company, and it's my primary transport for work." Margaret stepped forward, her tone clipped. "Maddie, don't be difficult. This would mean so much for appearances. The Wallaces have several important events coming up, and arriving by helicopter sends the right message." I took a deep breath, keeping my voice even. "I worked 10 years to afford that aircraft. It's insured, maintained, and piloted under my name. It's not a family toy." Claire's lips pressed into a line, her bouquet trembling slightly in her hands. "Dad, see, I told you she'd refuse." Richard's eyes darkened. His jaw tightened and he took one step toward me. "Maddie, this is your sister's wedding day. A reasonable person would say yes. Reasonable doesn't mean letting go of what I've earned just to make someone else look good." The room went still. Patricia's smile froze. Ethan looked away. Margaret's gaze darted between us as if willing me to cave. Richard's hand moved faster than my mind could process. A sharp crack rang in my ears before the sting bloomed across my cheek. The impact wasn't just physical, it landed deep somewhere between my ribcage and my pride. A couple of guests standing just outside the half-open door gasped. I saw the flicker of movement, someone stepping back quickly, another raising a phone before lowering it again. I straightened, my face hot but my spine unbending. I looked at each of them one by one, and no one met my eyes. "Enjoy the rest of the evening." I turned, opened the door, and stepped back into the hum of music and laughter. The contrast was jarring. People danced under crystal lights while my skin still burned from his hand. I walked past the champagne tower, past the line of photographers waiting for the next toast, and out the front doors into the cool salt air. The gravel crunched under my heels as I crossed the driveway. Somewhere behind me, laughter spilled out of the open windows, but it felt miles away. The valet jogged toward me, keys in hand, but I waved him off and walked straight to my car. When I slid into the driver's seat, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. My makeup was still perfect, the pearl necklace still in place, but my eyes looked sharper than they had an hour ago. I started the engine without looking back. The gates of Seaview Estate swung open and the night swallowed me whole. The ocean stretched black and endless to my left, the road unwinding ahead, and in my mind a single thought settled like stone. This wasn't over. I kept driving until the lights of the estate faded into the darkness and the sound of the waves softened under the hum of the tires. My cheeks still throbbed, but my mind had already drifted far from the wedding. It went to the one place no one could touch, the space I had built with my own hands and my own stubborn will. Back in 2015, I was just another overworked graduate student at NYU Stern, living in a studio apartment in Westchester County and juggling part-time jobs to cover tuition. My plan had been straightforward: finish my MBA, land a corporate job, and work my way up. But the more I sat in fluorescent-lit classrooms listening to case studies, the more I felt a pull towards something less predictable. That pull became an obsession the day a client I was interning for invited me to a networking event at Teterboro Airport. I remember stepping onto the tarmac, the late autumn air crisp against my face, and seeing a sleek black helicopter lift into the sky with the ease of a bird. I stood there frozen, watching it disappear into the clouds, and something in me shifted. Within a month, I had signed up for an introductory flight lesson. The first time I felt the controls under my hands, the thrum of the rotor above, I knew I was never going back to the life I had imagined. After graduation, instead of joining a consulting firm like my classmates, I enrolled at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University to pursue my rotorcraft training. It was a steep climb financially and mentally, but every hour logged brought me closer to the license I dreamed of. The day I passed my check ride for the private pilot license rotorcraft helicopter, my instructor clapped me on the shoulder and said I had the touch for this. I went home and slept for 12 hours straight, the weight of years of work finally settling in. For the next few years, I worked wherever I could get flight time. Charter services, sightseeing tours, even medical transport contracts. I flew in snowstorms over upstate New York and summer haze above the Jersey Shore. I learned how to read the mood of the wind and how to land on a rooftop helipad without breaking a sweat. By 2020, I had enough saved and enough industry contacts to start my own company, Whitmore Air Services, LLC, catering to VIP clients who needed fast, discreet transport in and out of the city. The pandemic slowed everything at first, but by the following year, my business was thriving. Clients trusted me not just to get them from point A to point B, but to do it without attracting attention. The Bell 429 came into my life on a late spring afternoon. I had been scouting for a twin engine that could handle both short city hops and longer range flights. At the hangar in White Plains, a broker walked me toward it like he was leading me to an altar. The fuselage gleamed white with deep blue striping the cabin, lined with cream leather seats that smelled faintly of cedar and fuel. When he told me the price, $3.2 million, my stomach tightened. But I also knew what it represented. Not extravagance, but independence. I bought it through the LLC to ensure it stayed tied to my professional life, insulated from personal entanglements. Signing that paperwork felt like signing a pact with my younger self, the one who had stood on the tarmac years ago watching someone else fly away. The first time I flew it over Manhattan was an early Sunday morning. The sun was low enough to cast long golden shadows over the skyline, and the rivers glittered like molten glass. I took off from Teterboro, the city opening up beneath me, the Hudson to my right and the grid of streets stretching toward the horizon. From up there, the chaos of New York looked orderly, almost serene. I passed over the George Washington Bridge, skirted the edge of Central Park, and caught sight of the Statue of Liberty in the distance. The air was smooth, the hum of the twin engines steady, and for the first time in years, I felt entirely in control of my life. That helicopter wasn't just a machine. It was my boundary line, the physical proof of what I had built when no one believed I could. It was where no one could corner me in a side room and demand a piece of what I'd earned. I pulled the car into my driveway in Westchester, the porch light casting a pool of gold over the gravel. Inside, I kicked off my heels, hung the pearl necklace on its stand, and went straight to the window that overlooked my small private helipad. Even in the dark, I could make out the silhouette of the Bell under its cover waiting. Some people feel safe locking their front door. For me, safety was knowing that at any moment I could step into that cockpit, lift into the air, and leave the noise behind. I closed the curtains and let the quiet settle. There would be calls tomorrow, explanations demanded, gossip whispered. But tonight all that mattered was the steady hum I could almost hear in my memory, the promise that my space, my air was still mine. The morning after the wedding, I drove to my parents' house in Westchester more out of duty than desire. The old colonial sat back from the road, the white paint still fresh from its last renovation, the front porch draped in hanging ferns my mother replaced every spring. Walking up those steps always felt like stepping back into a version of myself I had outgrown. Inside, the air smelled faintly of lemon polish and the cinnamon rolls my mother baked for Sunday breakfast. She was in the kitchen, her posture perfectly straight as she poured coffee into delicate china cups. My father sat at the head of the table reading the business section, his gold watch glinting every time he turned a page. Claire breezed in a few minutes later, wearing a silk blouse, the color of champagne, her hair pulled into an effortless knot that probably took half an hour to perfect. She kissed our mother's cheek, then leaned over to show her something on her hand. A flash of light caught my eye. I didn't need to be told what it was. The diamond was enormous, the kind of stone you saw in glossy magazine spreads, and it sparkled under the kitchen lights like it knew it was the center of attention. Mother let out a delighted gasp, covering her mouth as if she hadn't already known about the proposal. Father set down his paper, his face breaking into a rare smile. Claire tilted her hand toward me, her eyes locking with mine. Her smile was sweet, but there was a sharpness in it, like she was offering me a choice between admiration and resentment. Ethan proposed last night, she said, her tone casual but carrying just enough weight to make the room feel smaller. I congratulated her, my voice even. She didn't miss the slight pause before I spoke. I knew because Claire had always been the type to read hesitation as clearly as words. Growing up, the pattern had been impossible to ignore. Claire was the one who got the new car at 16, a navy blue convertible she drove to high school while I took the bus. When she wanted to spend a semester abroad in Florence, my parents wired the tuition and living expenses without blinking. When I applied for an MBA loan, my father told me it would be good for me to take on the debt myself so I'd appreciate it more. It was never said outright, but the rules were clear. For Claire, the answer was yes. For me, the answer was you'll figure it out. Even as adults, the current never changed. My parents saw her as someone to invest in, someone whose success was tied to the family's image. I was the one they expected to manage on my own, the one who didn't need help because I'd proven I could do without it. As the coffee was poured and the conversation shifted to wedding plans, I noticed how naturally my mother referred to Ethan's family as if they were already an extension of ours. The Wallaces, with their old money and sprawling properties, represented something she had always quietly wanted. In her mind, Claire's marriage was more than love. It was a step up. We'll need to make sure everything about the ceremony reflects the importance of this union, my mother said, her eyes bright. She spoke as if she were planning a diplomatic event rather than her younger daughter's wedding. Claire leaned back, swirling the coffee in her cup. Ethan's parents have already offered to host part of the celebration at their estate in Newport. And they have some ideas for the arrivals. I could feel her gaze flicker toward me again, a quick glance that made me wonder if she already had something specific in mind. The air between us was polite but brittle. I thought back to the years I had spent building my business while she moved through a world where doors seemed to open before she even knocked. There had always been an unspoken understanding that her wins were family wins while mine were simply mine. As breakfast wound down, Claire stood and walked over to where I sat, placing her manicured hand on my shoulder. I'm glad you could make it today, Maddie. I know you're busy. The words were warm on the surface, but there was a current underneath, a reminder that in this house she was the one who drew the lines. I looked at her hand, at the diamond catching the light again, and gave a small nod. The kitchen felt warmer than it should have, the smell of cinnamon suddenly too sweet. The conversation shifted to florists and catering, my mother making notes in her planner as if every detail had already been decided. I excused myself, stepping out onto the porch. The air outside was cooler, the trees whispering in the breeze, and for a moment I just stood there letting the quiet sink in. Behind me through the window, I could see Claire laughing with our mother, the ring flashing again as she gestured. The sight tightened something in my chest, not because I envied her, but because I understood exactly where this was headed. I walked down the steps slowly, my heels clicking against the wood, and made my way toward the driveway. Some stories in families never changed. They just found new ways to repeat themselves. By Monday morning, I was back at Teterboro, the hum of jet engines in the distance mixing with the low chatter from the hangar floor. The air smelled faintly of jet fuel and coffee, a scent that had become part of my life since the day I opened Grant Aviation's office here. Allison Brooks was already leaning against my desk when I walked in, arms crossed, her dark hair pulled back into a neat ponytail. She didn't waste time. "You're not going to like this," she said, sliding her phone across the desk. On the screen was a text thread from one of her contacts in Manhattan's finance circle. The message was brief but loaded. Word is the Wallaces are tightening things up. Liquidity issues, need to maintain their profile. I read it twice, my brow tightening. "That's gossip," I said, handing the phone back. "They've got more real estate than they know what to do with." Allison's expression stayed flat. "You know I don't bring you tabloid talk. If they're under pressure to look steady, they'll use whatever assets they can leverage. And you, my friend, have a very photogenic asset." I gave a small dismissive shake of my head. "You think they're going to come after my helicopter? I think if they can make it look like a family loan, they might not even see it as coming after you," she said. "In their world, everything's optics. If they need to arrive somewhere in style, they won't charter. They'll try to borrow from inside the circle." I leaned back in my chair, the leather creaking softly. I had heard rumors before about the Wallaces overextending themselves, but they were the kind of people who could host a gala for 500 guests while insisting they were cutting back. Allison was good at spotting trouble early, but even she could be wrong. Still, her words clung to me through the day, following me into meetings and phone calls. By the time the sun dipped behind the hangar roofs, I had almost convinced myself she was reading too much into it. A week later, I was in the operations office reviewing maintenance schedules when my phone buzzed. It was Marco, the FBO manager at Teterboro, a man who had been in the business long enough to know every legitimate client and every opportunist who came sniffing around. "Hey Maddie," he said, his tone careful. "Got a couple of inquiries here you might want to know about." "What kind of inquiries?" They didn't book anything. "Just asked some odd questions. Wanted to know about your services and if you operated on short notice for VIP transfers." No names, no company, just said they'd heard good things about Grant Aviation. I felt my stomach tighten. "Did they mention any specific dates?" Marco hesitated. "Not directly, but they hinted at needing something in late summer, maybe around August. And here's the part you'll like even less. One of them asked if you kept your helicopter here or somewhere else." I stood up, pressing my fingers against the edge of the desk. "Did they give you a card number, cashmere coat, expensive watch, the whole deal?" "But no card. Said they'd call back." After I hung up, I stared out the window at the row of sleek aircraft parked along the tarmac. The Bell 429 was in its usual spot, gleaming in the afternoon light, the silver and blue paint catching every shift of the sun. It was possible this was nothing. Inquiries came in all the time. But Marco knew the difference between curiosity and targeted interest. This had the scent of the latter. By evening, I had gone through my mental list of people who might have put my name in the wrong conversation. The Wallaces were at the top. They moved in circles where exclusivity was currency, and nothing said exclusive like arriving by private helicopter. I thought back to Allison's warning and felt a slow unease settle in. Maybe it was coincidence. Or maybe the pieces were starting to line up in a way I didn't want to admit. I locked up the office and walked across the hangar, my heels echoing against the concrete. Outside, the air was cool, the kind that carried the faint metallic scent of the runway at dusk. I paused beside the Bell, running my hand along the curve of its fuselage. It was mine. Purchased through my LLC, insured in my name, maintained to my standards. It had taken years of work to get here, to step inside this hangar and see something I had built from the ground up. The thought of anyone treating it like a prop for their image made my jaw tighten. Still, without proof, there was nothing to confront. Not yet. I checked the rotor locks and the hangar doors, a habit more than a necessity, and walked back toward my car. Somewhere between Allison's warning and Marco's careful tone, the air around this whole situation had shifted. The runway lights flickered on in the distance as I started the engine. A plane lifted off into the darkening sky, its lights blinking steadily as it climbed. I sat there for a moment watching it disappear into the clouds, the hum of possibility and caution running side by side in my mind. The Hamptons were dressed in their summer best when I pulled up to the Wallace property. White hydrangeas spilled over the stone walls and the air carried the faint briny edge of the ocean. The house itself was a sprawling shingle-style rental with wide verandas and manicured lawns that sloped down toward a private stretch of sand. It was late afternoon and the place was buzzing with caterers, florists, and planners, the hum of final preparations before the wedding weekend. Inside, I moved through rooms that smelled of fresh-cut roses and polished wood looking for Claire. She was somewhere with her stylist, according to Margaret, who intercepted me in the hall with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She waved me toward the back patio where most of the family had gathered. That was when I heard Patricia Wallace's voice floating through the open French doors, smooth and confident. "We'll have the flight right after the ceremony," she was saying. "The timing's perfect. Guests will be distracted with the reception and we'll be in Montauk in under half an hour." I froze. My eyes flicked to the seating area beyond the doors. Patricia stood near the railing, a glass of white wine in hand, her pearls catching the late-day sun. Around her, a small group of well-dressed guests nodded along as if she were describing a catered lunch, not my personal aircraft. One man asked where they'd land, and she smiled, tipping her head in that effortless way practiced by women who have spent decades orchestrating appearances. "Oh, the Montauk Yacht Club, of course. Ethan wants a quick escape and Claire loves the idea of arriving by helicopter." The words landed sharp. Not a suggestion, not a possibility. A plan. I stepped closer, just inside the door where I could see more of the patio without being obvious. Claire was there, seated on a wicker love seat, her engagement ring catching the light. She saw me almost immediately. Her smile faltered just for a second before she looked away and busied herself adjusting the hem of her dress. She didn't speak. She didn't correct Patricia. The conversation carried on around them, casual and certain. Someone asked about the weather forecast for Sunday and Patricia assured them she'd already checked. Clear skies, light wind. Ideal flying conditions. I stood there, pulse steady but cold. It was one thing to suspect, another to hear it laid out in public like an itinerary. There was no mention of asking me. No acknowledgement that the helicopter didn't belong to them. Margaret appeared at my elbow, murmuring something about the dessert tasting. I nodded without really hearing her, my focus still fixed on the scene outside. The laughter, the easy confidence in Patricia's voice, the way Ethan rested his hand on Claire's knee as if he'd already earned every privilege in my world. I left the doorway and made my way upstairs to the guest room they had assigned me. My bag sat neatly by the bed, untouched. I closed the door and leaned against it, listening to the muffled sounds of chatter drifting up from below. They had chosen the Montauk Yacht Club for the landing. That was a 25-minute flight from here, maybe less in good wind. I pictured the Bell 429 cutting across the water. Claire's hair perfectly styled, Ethan at her side, photographers ready to capture the moment. It wasn't about transportation, it was about spectacle. I sat on the edge of the bed and let the realization sink in. This wasn't carelessness or misunderstanding. They had scheduled my aircraft without so much as a phone call. Patricia was speaking in the past tense as though arrangements had already been confirmed. Claire's silence was its own form of consent. The faint hum of a generator outside filled the quiet in the room. I reached for my phone and opened my calendar, scrolling through the coming week. My helicopter's schedule was clear for Sunday. I had left it open intentionally, thinking I might take an evening flight myself. Now I understood why no one had bothered to check availability. They had assumed. I tried to imagine the conversation in which they decided this. Maybe over dinner, glasses of wine in hand, someone floated the idea. Patricia, always quick to turn suggestion into certainty, probably had it slotted into the day's timeline before dessert. Claire, flattered and eager to please, didn't challenge it. Ethan, who had known me less than a year, likely saw it as a harmless family favor. The truth was, they didn't see the helicopter as mine. They saw it as an accessory in the Grant family's shared image, something to be deployed when it suited them. And I, the one who had built the business and signed the purchase papers, was apparently the last to be informed. A burst of laughter rose from the patio, pulling me to the window. From here I could see them small against the sweep of the lawn. Patricia gestured toward the horizon as if plotting their airborne path. Claire glanced up at the house, her gaze flicking over the windows until it landed briefly on mine. Her expression was unreadable, but she didn't look away right away. I closed the curtains and stepped back into the stillness of the room. There was nothing to say tonight, not here, not with the house full of people and the air thick with rehearsed charm. But the line between suspicion and certainty had been crossed. Now I knew exactly what I was dealing with. The hallway felt smaller on the way out, the air thicker, every step measured. I could still feel the heat on my cheek, sharp and stubborn, but my mind was clearer than it had been all evening. The room I had just left was heavy with the memory of Patricia's voice describing my helicopter as if it were hers to give away, and the quick flick of Claire's eyes avoiding mine. The double doors at the end of the corridor opened to a rush of night air and the muffled thump of music from the reception. My heels hit the stone steps, the distant chatter of guests blending with the hiss of the ocean beyond the dunes. The cool air should have soothed the sting on my face, but it only made it more vivid. Two couples stood near the veranda rail, their conversation lowering as I passed. One woman leaned toward the other, eyes darting between my face and the path ahead. In the corner of my vision, I caught the slow lift of a phone, the glint of a camera lens catching the light. A small flash, quick and almost polite, followed by the faint click of a shutter. They didn't even pretend to hide it. I kept walking down the gravel path toward the valet stand. A white Range Rover idled nearby, the driver glancing at me in the rearview mirror before pretending to adjust the air vents. The sound of my own breathing filled the space between footsteps. At the edge of the driveway, the valet spotted me and jogged toward my car. Behind him, more guests lingered near the entrance, their voices like the rustle of leaves. I didn't need to hear the words to know the shape of them. Questions, speculation. The slap was already leaving the room in whispers. The car door closed with a solid thunk, sealing me inside. I gripped the wheel for a moment, not starting the engine, letting my eyes adjust to the quiet dark. The leather smelled faintly of salt from my last trip to Montauk. I could still hear my father's voice, low and sharp, telling me I was selfish. The image of Patricia's hands sweeping through the air as she mapped out the flight was right there with it. Headlights swept across the lot as another car pulled in. In the beam I caught the movement of the same guest with the phone now speaking to someone else, both glancing my way. I imagined the photo already traveling through group chats, each recipient adding their own version of what had happened. The valet's flashlight waved once in my mirror, a silent question. I started the engine and eased the car forward, the tires crunching over gravel. The music from the tent faded, replaced by the low hum of the engine and the distant call of the ocean. Halfway down the long drive, I passed a small knot of guests walking toward the road, their laughter falling away as they recognized me. One man turned his head to follow my car, his expression unreadable in the shadows. I kept my gaze ahead, the tree-lined road narrowing into darkness. At the gate, the security guard gave a short nod, pressing the button that swung the wrought iron open. The sound of the hinges was slow and deliberate, like a clock counting down. Beyond the gates, the world was still and empty, the black ribbon of road stretching ahead. I didn't look back. Whatever had just happened would be picked apart for days, maybe weeks, but I wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing hesitation. My cheek throbbed with each heartbeat, a steady reminder that this wasn't just about a helicopter. It was about the line they had crossed and how casually they'd done it. The taillights painted the trees red as I turned onto the coastal road. Somewhere behind me, in a tent filled with music and champagne, they would be crafting their own version of the night. Somewhere on a phone, the flash I'd seen would be frozen, ready to be shown and re-shown until it became something else entirely. For now, I just drove the ocean to my left, the dark pressing close, the only sound the rhythm of the tires on the asphalt. There would be time to figure out exactly how much they had taken for granted. Tonight, all I needed was distance. The next morning, the sunlight cut across my desk in long, sharp lines, catching the edges of a stack of unopened mail. I had barely touched my coffee when Allison's name lit up my phone. Her voice was tight, the kind of tone she only used when something was bad enough to skip small talk. She told me to come by her place in Midtown. When I got there, she was already pacing in front of her kitchen island, laptop open. She didn't bother with hello, just spun the screen toward me. An email chain glowed against the white light of her inbox. At the top was a message from Ethan, my sister's brand new husband, sent to someone at a luxury travel agency. Attached were 3 high-resolution shots of my Bell 429 one taken mid-flight over the Hudson, another on the pad at Teterboro, the third framed perfectly in front of the hangar with my company logo crisp and visible. Beneath the images, his words were casual but calculated. He called it a unique opportunity for premium wedding guests to travel in style, complete with champagne service and aerial photography. It was dressed up like a business pitch, but every detail reeked of assumption. Allison clicked another tab and pulled up a second message forwarded from someone in her finance network. This one was from Patricia, sent to a private event planner. She was confirming a request to reserve a hangar space at Teterboro on a specific Saturday, the same day as their Montauk reception, so they could stage a celebratory send-off with a wedding banner strung across the entrance. My stomach tightened. It wasn't just that they had planned to use my aircraft. They had folded it into their image, made it part of their sales pitch to the world without asking if I would even allow it. I drove straight to Teterboro after leaving Allison's. The sky was bright and sharp, the kind of winter air that felt like it could cut glass. Inside the FBO lounge, the manager Tom looked up from his desk. His expression shifted when he saw me, a flicker of recognition followed by something more cautious. He hesitated before answering my questions. Yes, Patricia had been there twice in the past month. She had asked general questions about scheduling and hangar access, even inquired whether it was possible to arrange a decorative setup for a helicopter departure. She hadn't booked anything under my name, but the intent was obvious. By the time I left the lounge, the pieces were lining up too neatly to ignore. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment fantasy cooked up after a glass of champagne. It was a strategy built over weeks, assuming my compliance. Back in my office, I called Jessica Carter. She had been my attorney since I formed Grant Aviation and knew every inch of the legal framework around aircraft ownership. I laid out what I'd found: the emails, the hangar request, Tom's confirmation. She listened without interrupting, then asked one question. Were Ethan or Patricia listed as named pilots on my insurance? No, I told her. Only me and 2 contracted pilots I personally vetted. She let out a short laugh that held no humor. That meant they could not fly it, operate it, or even authorize its movement without my explicit consent. The law and my insurance were entirely on my side. I leaned back in my chair, letting her words settle. It was the first moment since the wedding that I felt something close to control. Jessica reminded me to document everything, to make sure the FBO had a standing note that no third party had clearance, and to lock all flight schedules. The afternoon sun dipped low as I printed the email chains and slid them into a folder. The office was quiet except for the faint ticking of the wall clock. Every sound felt amplified, the weight of the situation pressing in on all sides. They had planned to turn my hard-earned asset into their stage prop. They had traded on my name and my company without the courtesy of asking. And now, with the proof in my hands, I could see their plan for what it was. Deliberate, entitled, and completely blind to the idea that I might say no. I closed the folder and set it on the corner of my desk. The hum of the building's heating system filled the silence. Outside, the runway lights were just beginning to glow, a reminder that every departure here started with permission. And mine was the only one that mattered. The winter air felt sharper than usual when I stepped out of the building and crossed the parking lot toward my SUV. The runway lights shimmered in the distance, tiny beacons in the darkening sky, and the low rumble of a jet taking off rolled across the tarmac. I unlocked the car, slid behind the wheel, and just sat there for a moment with my hands resting on the steering wheel. My mind was already arranging the steps I needed to take. If they wanted to make my helicopter part of their wedding spectacle, they would find the doors locked long before they could reach the hangar. By the time I drove to Teterboro the next morning, the frost was still clinging to the chain-link fence around the property. I punched in my code at the gate, the keypad beeping in its usual friendly tone, but that sound now felt far too casual. I needed those codes changed. All of them. Inside the hangar, the Bell 429 waited under the soft white glow of the overhead lights. I had always thought of her as an extension of myself, sleek, precise, capable. Now I saw her as something else too, a target. I spotted Mark, the hangar manager, leaning over a workbench with a clipboard in his hand. "Morning," he said without looking up. "I need every access code changed," I told him. "Hangar doors, gate maintenance, bay storage, everything. By noon if possible." He straightened, eyebrows lifting. "That's a lot of locks at once. Should I know why?" "It's a security upgrade," I said, keeping my voice even. "No exceptions, no delays." He studied me for a moment, then nodded. "I'll start with the main doors. You'll have new cards and codes by midday." From there I went into my small office at the far end of the hangar and picked up the phone to call my insurance agent Stephanie. She answered on the second ring, her voice as brisk as always. "I need to update the policy," I said. "Immediately. Remove every pilot except me and my 2 contracted crew. No alternates, no temporary authorizations." Stephanie tapped away on her keyboard, reading the changes back to me. She promised updated policy documents within the hour and confirmed that any attempt to file a claim from an unauthorized pilot would be flagged. After hanging up, I opened my laptop and drafted an email to the FBO that handled most of my flights. The subject line was simple: operational restriction, effective immediately. I spelled it out plainly: no dispatch, no fueling, no movement without written approval from my personal email account. I CC'd my attorney Jessica Carter, knowing she'd follow up with legal language. Jessica didn't waste time. She called me 10 minutes later. "I'm preparing a formal trespass warning," she said. "It'll be addressed to Ethan Wallace, Patricia Wallace, and any representative attempting to access your aircraft. Under New Jersey law, unauthorized entry into the hangar or operation of your helicopter constitutes criminal trespass." I told her to draft it and have it ready for me to sign in person. I wanted my signature on paper before the day was over. Driving into Manhattan to her office, I felt the shift inside me. Just a week ago, I would have convinced myself that this was all paranoia, that no one would really cross such a blatant line. But now I knew better. Jessica's office was warm and smelled faintly of coffee and polished wood. She spread the letter across the conference table, her pen poised for me. The language was unambiguous. I signed and she slid copies into a heavy envelope. From there, I went straight to my bank. My LLC's accounts had always been secure, but I wasn't taking chances. The branch manager greeted me by name, and I requested an immediate revision to the authorized contacts list. As of now, only I and my CPA had access. No one else could request wire transfers, see balances, or change account details. The manager printed the updated forms and I slipped them into my bag. By the time I returned to Teterboro, Mark had a laminated card ready with the new codes. He also handed me a small plastic bag containing my old keycard, its access now void. "All set," he said. "No one gets in without your say-so." I thanked him and walked across the echoing hangar floor toward the Bell. The polished white and silver of her body gleamed under the lights, her rotor blades catching faint reflections. I climbed into the cockpit, running my hands over the controls. I didn't start the engine. I just sat there listening to the faint hum of the building, imagining the sound of the rotors spinning overhead. This was my space. My air. Climbing down, I walked to the massive steel doors at the far end of the hangar. My fingers found the control panel and I pressed the button. The motors engaged with a deep hum, the doors sliding shut inch by inch. The echo filled the empty space until the last sliver of daylight was cut off and the heavy panels met with a solid metallic thud. Then came the new lock's electronic click, a crisp, definitive sound that was more than mechanical. It was the sound of a line drawn in steel. I stood there for a long moment, breathing in the stillness. Outside, the wind whipped across the tarmac, but in here the air was calm, untouched. They could make their plans and their assumptions, but without my permission, not a single blade would turn. When I finally stepped outside, The sky had deepened to navy, the first stars appearing over the airport. I locked the smaller personnel door behind me and felt the weight of the key in my hand. It was a small thing, that key, but it held more power now than any approval they had expected from me. I walked back to my SUV, the frost already forming again along the roof. Somewhere my family was still celebrating, still convincing themselves that they could charm or pressure me into surrendering what I had built. Let them think it. The hangar was sealed, the accounts were secure, and my name was the only one that mattered. When I started the engine, the headlights swept across the closed hangar doors. They looked almost like the gates of a fortress. In a way, that's exactly what they were. 2 days later, I started hearing the first cracks in their perfect plans. It came in the form of a message from Allison, who sent me a blurry photo of Claire and Ethan leaving a hotel lobby in Midtown surrounded by a few irritated-looking guests. Under the picture, she had typed only 3 words. No helicopter today. By noon, the story was making the rounds in our circles. The weekend charity gala in Greenwich, the one they had bragged about arriving at in style, had come and gone without their grand entrance. Instead, they had sat in traffic for almost 2 hours, missing the first course and sliding into their seats while the speeches had already started. The photo of Claire looking tense in the back of a black SUV was already on social media. That night, my phone lit up with her name. I let it ring once before answering. "You're making us look ridiculous," she said without preamble. "I'm protecting my property," I said. "That is my right. This is family, Maddie." "You're acting like someone who owns what she worked for," I interrupted. "You'll figure out a way to manage without it." The silence on the line was sharp, almost brittle. Then she hung up without another word. By the end of the week, Ethan's office had called Allison to cancel a small corporate event in Montauk. Apparently, the plan had been to impress a group of potential investors by flying them in, but with the aircraft unavailable, the logistics didn't work. They lost a sizable deposit on the venue. Allison told me this with a tone halfway between sympathy and satisfaction. "It's starting to get around," she said. "People are whispering about the Wallaces not being able to cover some of their commitments." I didn't respond right away. I knew how fast rumors could spiral, but I also knew I had done nothing to start them. I had simply removed access to something that was mine. What people did with the vacuum left behind was on them. A week later, there was another cancellation, this one more public. The Spring Art Benefit in Manhattan had been one of their most boasted about appearances. Claire had told half the family she would be arriving, with Ethan landing at the heliport near East 34th Street, stepping right onto the carpet in her gown. Invitations had been sent with that detail whispered as if it were a special privilege. When the evening came, they never arrived. I was at a table near the stage, having been invited months earlier by one of the organizers. I saw the looks ripple through the crowd as it became clear the Wallaces weren't coming. People leaned toward each other, speaking in low voices, some smiling, in that way people do when they smell gossip. Later, I overheard one of Ethan's business acquaintances say that whatever deal he was chasing must not be as solid as he claimed. In New York, appearance was currency, and missing a public commitment was like dropping a handful of bills into the wind. The next morning, Claire tried again, this time with a different tactic. "Do you have any idea how embarrassing it is to explain to people why we're not showing up the way we said we would?" she demanded. "I don't see how that's my problem," I said. "I never promised anyone anything on your behalf. You're making it impossible for us to." I cut her off. You made it impossible the moment you assumed my consent without asking." Her breath hitched in a way that told me the conversation was over, and sure enough, she hung up. The calls slowed after that. The silence from their side became almost as deliberate as my own. Every so often, Allison would forward me another whisper from someone in the city or a link to an article speculating on the Wallaces' finances. None of it came from me. All I had done was refuse to lend them what they believed they were entitled to. One evening, I passed by the hangar after a meeting in the city. The sky was painted with the last streaks of pink and gold, and the bell sat gleaming under the soft lights. The air was quiet except for the faint hum of the airport beyond. I walked up to the steel doors and rested my hand against the cold metal. Inside was every flight I had earned, every mile I had logged, every decision I had made without anyone's permission. Out here, their carefully planned image was starting to crumble without my help. I locked the door again and stood there for a moment listening to the wind sweep across the tarmac. Somewhere in the city, Claire and Ethan were scrambling for alternatives, trying to hold together a picture that was already fraying at the edges. I didn't need to see it to know the damage was spreading. The first sign came in the form of a link from Allison sent just after sunrise. I tapped it without thinking, and there it was, shaky phone footage from the wedding, the grainy glow of chandeliers overhead, and in the center of the frame, my father's hand connecting sharply with my cheek. The sound was muffled by laughter and clinking glasses, but the movement spoke louder than any audio could. In the background, a few faces were caught mid-gasp, others frozen in that stunned, silent stare. I watched it twice, not for the impact itself, but for the details around it. The way Claire's expression didn't change. The way Ethan shifted slightly as if deciding whether to step in or let it play out. The cluster of guests in the doorway, leaning just far enough forward to see. When I set the phone down, my inbox was already filling. Some messages were laced with faux concern. "Are you all right? I heard there was a misunderstanding," while others were blunt in their curiosity. In certain circles, a clip like that didn't stay private for long. It didn't need to hit a gossip site to do damage. In the country club lounges, the charity boardrooms, and the closed dinner tables of Westchester, this was already front-page news. 2 days later, Richard's name vanished from the Hudson Valley Arts Fund's list of trustees. The official email to members used polite language about a change in personal commitments, but Allison, who seemed to have an ear in every room, sent me the real story. They asked him to resign. The board didn't want a public explanation, but the video left them no choice, she said when I called her back. I imagined my father sitting in his office staring at the phone after that conversation, the weight of a humiliation he'd never had to carry before settling across his shoulders. Ethan's trouble followed close behind. A week later, a renewable energy firm he'd been courting for months abruptly announced a major partnership with someone else. I heard about it from a former client over coffee in Midtown. She stirred her latte slowly, her voice dropping even though we were in a crowded cafe. "They said he's all show, no foundation." Someone mentioned the helicopter thing and how it was never actually his. That kind of detail makes investors nervous. The words stayed with me long after we said goodbye. All show, no foundation. It was exactly the image they had built for themselves, and now the cracks were showing. Claire disappeared from the social calendar almost overnight. No more tagged lunches at the plaza. No society pages capturing her outside Bergdorf's. Even her carefully staged Instagram posts dried up. If she went out, it was without fanfare, and I wondered if she was hiding from the pitying smiles or the whispered commentary that followed her through every boutique. I hadn't lifted a finger to push any of it along. I had simply shut my hangar doors, updated my security, and let absence do its work. Without the image they had counted on, their version of control started to erode on its own. One crisp Thursday afternoon, my phone rang, and Allison didn't bother with a hello. "You are going to love this," she said, her voice bright. "Do you remember the Branson Foundation? The one that funds those high-profile donor flights for environmental causes?" "Yes," I said, leaning back in my chair. "They've been vetting air service providers for their East Coast events, and your name came up in the meeting. Apparently one of their committee members saw how you handled your family situation and called it textbook discipline. They're impressed you stuck to your contracts and didn't cave to pressure." I could almost hear her smile through the phone. "They want to meet next week. This could be huge, Maddie." I let the news settle, my eyes drifting toward the window. Outside, a private jet was easing toward the runway, its movements deliberate, measured. Clearance wasn't given lightly here, and once it was, every second mattered. It was a dance of timing and trust, two things I had guarded fiercely in my own business. The irony wasn't lost on me. My refusal to let my family use my helicopter without permission had been painted as selfishness in their story, yet in the professional world it was being recognized as integrity. The same act that closed certain doors was opening others. Later that evening, I took a walk along the edge of the tarmac. The air smelled faintly of jet fuel, and somewhere in the distance, a helicopter's rotors began their slow, deep churn. That sound had always steadied me. It reminded me of focus, of preparation, of every hour I'd put into building something that couldn't be taken just because someone else wanted it. I thought about the shifting silence in my family now. The absence of calls, the empty seats at events, the way their names were slowly retreating from the places they once dominated. This wasn't revenge in the cinematic sense. No shouting, no public declarations. Just boundaries held steady until the people who had ignored them had to face what that meant. The sun had dipped low enough to throw long-angled shadows across the pavement. I stood there for a while watching them stretch toward the hangars. In a way, it felt like standing at the edge of a new runway, the path ahead clear and mine alone to take. Some storms you have to fight head-on. Others you let pass while you hold your ground. This one I had weathered by staying still, and somehow I had come out ahead. Dr. Eleanor Marks had a way of arranging the chairs in a perfect circle that made it impossible to hide. No matter where you sat, you faced someone directly, and in my case that meant my mother across from me. My father angled just to her right, and Claire 2 seats down, legs crossed, arms folded like she was here under court order. The walls were a calming sage green, the light soft, but the tension was sharp enough to slice through the air. Eleanor started with her usual invitation for anyone to speak. For a moment only the quiet hum of the air vent answered her. Then my father cleared his throat, looking past me toward the far wall. I think he said, choosing his words like they might break apart if he handled them too roughly. There were misunderstandings. Things got out of hand. But it was a wedding. Emotions run high. It wasn't an apology, and we both knew it. I kept my face neutral. My mother leaned forward slightly, palms pressed together in a gesture I recognized from years of her smoothing over my father's messes. Richard was under a lot of stress that day. We all were. And I think you know, Maddie, none of it was meant to hurt you personally. It was about making the day perfect for Claire and Ethan. Eleanor glanced at me, an almost imperceptible nod to take the floor if I wanted it. I did. I hear what you're both saying, I said evenly, but this isn't about one day. It's about a pattern. I'm not here to debate what you meant or didn't mean. I'm here to make my boundaries clear. I will help when I choose to. Not when I'm pressured, guilted, or cornered in public. If that's too difficult to understand, then we don't need to pretend we have an agreement. My father's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. My mother opened her mouth as if to respond, then shut it again. From my left, Claire let out a short, incredulous laugh. We wouldn't have had to corner you if you weren't so stubborn. We knew you'd refuse. So yes, we thought if we asked in front of people you might think twice before embarrassing the family. The words fell into the space between us, like a glass shattering. Even Claire seemed to realize what she had just admitted, because she quickly looked down at her lap. Eleanor didn't move, didn't even blink. So, you're saying the confrontation at the wedding was intentional, she said calmly, and designed to pressure Maddie into agreeing to something she had already declined in private. Claire shifted uncomfortably. That's not exactly. It's exactly what you said, I cut in, my voice steady but firm. And that's the problem. You didn't respect my answer, so you engineered a scene to get what you wanted. You underestimated me. Silence filled the room. My father stared at the carpet, my mother's lips pressed into a thin line. Claire picked at the edge of her sleeve, suddenly fascinated by a loose thread. Eleanor let the quiet stretch until it became almost unbearable. This, she said, finally is a moment to recognize that Maddie's boundaries are not negotiable. They exist whether or not you approve of them. No one spoke after that. When the session ended, the shuffle of coats and handbags felt louder than normal. Claire avoided my eyes entirely. My mother murmured something to Eleanor about rescheduling. My father walked out first, as if getting to the parking lot faster would erase the last hour. I stayed behind to gather my bag, taking my time. Eleanor touched my arm lightly. You were clear and direct. That's often harder than people think. It's harder when it's your own family, I admitted. Outside, the sky was a pale winter blue, the kind that looked colder than it felt. I wasn't ready to go home yet, so I drove to a small cafe a few blocks away. The place smelled like fresh bread and coffee beans, and the only sound was the quiet hiss of milk steaming behind the counter. I ordered a cappuccino and found a corner table. The first sip was rich and warm, but it was the space that felt most comforting. No one demanding explanations, no one rearranging my boundaries to suit their needs. Through the window, I saw Claire walk past on the sidewalk. She didn't see me, and I didn't call out. There was nothing to say that hadn't already been said. Some things were better left in the silence that followed the truth. The hum of the rotors blended with the wind rushing past the cabin, a sound I had come to love more than almost anything else. Below us, Manhattan stretched out like a living map, the grid of streets glittering in the winter sunlight, the rivers catching flashes of gold. Ryan sat beside me, relaxed in the co-pilot's seat, his headset tilted just enough so I could see the grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. A year had passed since the wedding, and every mile between then and now felt earned. Grant Aviation had doubled its contracts, adding charter agreements with corporate clients who valued reliability over showmanship. My calendar was full, not with family demands, but with meetings I had chosen, partnerships I had vetted. The hangar was busier than ever, yet it still felt like my sanctuary, every departure and arrival tied to my own say-so. Ryan pointed toward the East River, where a pair of seaplanes skimmed the water before lifting off. I dipped the nose slightly, giving us a better view of the bridges strung across the water like ribbons. There was a quiet pride in knowing that I had built this life without bending to the pressure that once threatened to box me in. Family still existed in the background, but only in the way distant weather systems do, something you notice but do not chase. Holidays were polite, short, and free of the old expectations. My father spoke little when I was in the room. My mother kept conversation to safe topics, and Claire kept her distance. There were no more surprise requests, no engineered moments to corner me. We existed in a truce born out of necessity rather than warmth, and I was fine with that. Ryan adjusted the radio, his voice calm as he confirmed our altitude with air traffic control. I glanced out at the Statue of Liberty in the distance, standing steadfast against the backdrop of the harbor. It struck me that this was exactly what I had fought for: freedom, not from my family itself, but from the weight of their entitlement. The past year had brought new contracts, yes, but also a shift inside me. I no longer measured my choices against the risk of upsetting someone else. I no longer waited for approval before taking a step forward. There was a lightness in that one that reminded me of the lift beneath the blades when the skids left the ground. We banked, left the skyline turning with us, and Ryan leaned closer. You ever think about how different things could have been if you'd just said yes that day? I smiled, eyes still on the horizon. Every now and then. And then I remember what it would have cost me. Some things you can't buy back. The radio crackled with a traffic advisory, and I responded automatically, my hands steady on the controls. The routine of it was grounding. Above the city, I felt entirely in my element, the air clear, the space mine. As we passed over Central Park, patches of snow outlined the winding paths below, and I thought about the version of myself who once might have given in for the sake of peace. She would have been watching someone else fly this route, her own name missing from the flight log, her boundaries dissolved into other people's celebrations. That wasn't me anymore. The Hudson came into view again, a ribbon of moving light, and I leveled us out for the return leg toward Teterboro. Ryan leaned back, content, and I felt that same deep contentment settle in my chest. Protecting what I built had not been easy. It had meant confrontation, silence, and walking away more than once. But it also meant I could look at the life I had now and know that every piece of it was mine by choice, not by someone else's design. As the hangar came into view in the distance, I eased the helicopter, lower the city slowly, giving way to the smaller grids of suburban streets. The rotor's steady rhythm felt like a heartbeat that matched my own. I had learned something in the past year that went beyond business or family politics. Control over your own life is not something you wait to be given. You claim it, protect it, and live it without apology. Approval fades. Freedom lasts. We touched down smoothly, the skids settling onto the pad, and I powered down the engine. The sudden quiet was striking, the kind that carries its own kind of satisfaction. Ryan unbuckled his harness and looked at me with that familiar half smile. Worth it, he asked. Every bit, I said. If you have ever had to set boundaries with your family, if you have had to protect what you've worked for even when it meant standing alone, I'd like to hear how you did it. Share your story, your turning point, or the moment you knew you couldn't keep giving in. This is a place where we understand what it means to hold the line and to keep flying on your own terms.